My name is Barbara Cummins. I'm convener of the Royal Town Planning Institute in Scotland for this year, and I'm just hosting this event. We've got some great speakers for you, and I will introduce them as they come along. But excitingly, we also have some illustrators who are joining us today. We've got Alice, Jenny and Jules, who will be illustrating the event live. So at the end, we'll have some fantastic visuals that will hopefully capture what the event has brought out. It won't be cartoons for the speakers, don't worry, it's actually what's being said and discussed. And I've seen the outputs of some of their work, and it's truly inspiring. It'll be something to take away and to share on social media afterwards. So just to get the event on the road, the People's Proposals for Planning, Places and Transport, I thought one of the things that I'd like to highlight from Scotland's Climate Assembly report and their recommendations for action was something I thought was a really excellent idea in a report, and it was the statement of ambition. We'll hear a little bit more on that later, but I thought the statements in that statement of ambition were superb, and there's something that we could all sign up to. The Assembly in the report called for action for change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and a fair way. I don't think we could argue with that. That the climate emergency is a real and urgent issue that cannot be ignored. So it's great that we're all here talking about it, not ignoring it. It requires immediate action at all levels of society. We all have a part to play. If we fail to act now, we will fail our current and future generations in Scotland and right across the world. We believe that urgent cultural change is needed across society, from governments, businesses, communities, and individuals. So that, think global, act local really does play here. And as a nation, we have the opportunity to be pioneers by taking immediate action to empower our next generations to lead sustainable lives by setting up the framework now. So we're going to hear about some of that today from our audience. And our first speaker will speak in detail about that Climate Assembly report and touch on those ambitions. So let me first of all introduce Susie Townsend. She heads the Secretariat for Scotland's Climate Assembly. She previously worked in Scottish Government's Climate Change Division, having previously and excitingly led a climate change team at the British Embassy in Berlin. Susie.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and indeed to RTPI for organising this event. I'm going to start off asking Jenny if she would just share a video for us which features two of our members, Maya and David, and we'll start off with that, please.
Hello. My name is David. I am a 71-year-old retired Glaswegian.
Hi, I'm Maya. I'm 10 and I live in the Highlands.
Older people grew up thinking that climate emergency was something far off into the future, if we thought of it at all. It's my reality now. We all have a responsibility to tackle it.
I've never known a time when the climate emergency didn't threaten my future. I can't see a world without it. It's something me and my friends are growing up with.
People from all walks of life were brought together as a mini Scotland to agree how the country needs to change to tackle extreme weather, damage to plants and animals under rivers and oceans, threats to our food supply. There's so much waste in how we do things at the moment. That needs to change now. This needs to go much further than just a bit of household recycling. We need immediate action to bring down Scotland's carbon emissions.
It can't just be down to us as individuals. We need everyone to pull together. Government, businesses and communities across Scotland. We need big changes. Changes to how we work, how we travel, how we build our buildings, how we heat our homes.
We can make big changes right now. Changes to how our public services are run, how we make sure we all understand the climate emergency, how we use our land, how our communities are connected, how our businesses work. We can make a better Scotland by making these changes together.
It's time for Scotland to take the lead in tackling the global climate emergency.
Scotland's Climate Assembly has laid down a mandate from ordinary citizens for immediate action. We can make a difference.
We can make a difference.
Thank you very much indeed. And now we'll just magically move on to the slides. Great, thank you. So as the member said there, a citizen assembly brings together a group of people who are broadly representative of the population to learn and deliberate about a topic before they make recommendations. Assembly members first learn from experts and each other's lived experience. This ensures every participant has the same foundational knowledge and their discussions and deliberations are evidence-based. Assembly members were selected to reflect the wider population, ensuring their recommendations are grounded in diverse backgrounds and experiences. Just over 100 members were selected and they were representative in terms of age, gender, disability, household income, geography, ethnicity, rurality, and attitudes to climate change. Special attention was paid to matters of inclusion, and statistically the selection process was very successful, as you can see from the next slides. For income, gender, ethnicity and disability, where there's often underrepresentation in formal consultations, we achieved representation very close to the national figures, as we did on all the other criteria. And this, of course, is incredibly important when you're asking people to bring their lived experience into the conversation. And the question which the members were asked to answer was, how should Scotland change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way? The Assembly met over 7 different weekends remotely due to the coronavirus pandemic, and they were split up into 3 streams for some of the time. Those were diet, land use and lifestyle, homes and communities, and work and travel. And together they heard from more than 100 speakers. As Barbara mentioned, as part of the Assembly process, the Assembly members themselves wrote an overarching statement of ambition. And this statement encapsulated a strong, united vision and is really inspiring. And I'd encourage you to read it either on our website or watch it, as the members also recorded it in full for YouTube. And it really does give a vision of how we can be in the future. In addition to creating concrete recommendations, Assembly members were asked to consider how to ensure fairness. So the question built in this idea of fairness, but we wanted them to decide what they meant themselves by fairness. And the evidence to the Assembly highlighted that climate change and some policies to tackle it disproportionately affect some people more than others. And as a result, Assembly members agreed on 22 different propositions of fairness, and these were the 2 which were the most popular. But as I say, there were 22 altogether. So I won't spend an awfully lot of time on the recommendations, as I think the speakers will go into these in more detail, but I do want to give a brief overview so that you can see the scope and ambition of our Assembly members' vision for a fairer and greener Scotland. A central recommendation for travel and transport was a demand for public transport to be free or at least cheaper. And they were very practical in their recommendations, looking for easier public transport through an Oyster card for Scotland and an integrated rail network. So they were absolutely bringing this lived experience into considering how could they make their recommendations practical as well as ambitious. Members saw the transition as a necessity, but also an opportunity, wanting Scotland to lead a new green revolution, investing in research and development and providing the infrastructure that was needed to support greener alternatives. A popular recommendation was the establishment of 20-minute communities. As you can see here, they wanted communities to have localised living and active travel at their core, and they wanted planning laws to be changed to enforce this. So this is talking about public spaces for walking and cycling and reforming the planning laws. Members also wanted their goals for thriving communities to be accessible to Scotland's rural communities. So this was not just a central belt ambition. They realised this might mean a shift in focus to remote, digital and mobile provision. And of course, very importantly, that there should be good broadband connectivity and free Wi-Fi and support to access the devices to use it. Finally, and you'll see how these bits that we're pulling out absolutely relate to the three speakers that we're going to hear from shortly. They also had a lot to say on planning, standards and regulations. And I know that we'll hear a lot more about this later, but I think the first recommendation here, which you have on the screen, serves as a good summary. Local authorities and planning departments need to ensure carbon sequestration, well-being, adaptation to manage extreme weather risk and biodiversity are all considered in planning decisions for urban areas and buildings. They also obviously spoke about Greenfield and Brownfield development, so prioritising Brownfield over Greenfield and passive house standard for new build. Finally, I think it's worth mentioning that robust standards and assessments were important to Assembly members. For example, members wanted buildings to be designed for energy efficiency and to be confident that the buildings, when they were built, actually delivered that energy efficiency in practice. They also wanted building design for recycling and reuse. So they were very concerned about embodied carbon, and they were concerned about the robust retrofitting quality standards to make sure that when people invested in retrofit for their homes, then they actually saw the benefit of that. I should perhaps note at this point that we're very fortunate to have one of our Assembly members, Shona, with us today. And so if people do have particular questions regarding what it was like to be an Assembly member, then we have somebody in the room who is able to speak to that. We recently published our Civic Charter, which is a public statement from respected individuals and organisations across Scottish society and highlights the support across Scotland for the Assembly's vision and recommendations. And you can see some of the organisations that have signed up to the Charter there. It's addressed to the Scottish Government, to Scottish Parliament and to Scottish society more broadly. And as I said, has over 100 wide-ranging signatories, including University of Aberdeen, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations and the Macker, Kathleen Jamie. The City of Edinburgh Council were an early signatory and so far are the only local authority to sign, which is disappointing. So I would like to join with Councillor McInnes from Edinburgh and really encourage other local authorities to follow suit. As she says, climate change is a real and urgent issue that we simply cannot ignore. So do please encourage your organisations to sign using the hashtag #SignForScotland, and feel free to contact us if you want more information about how you can get involved. And finally, before I hand over, I would just like to thank again RTPI and Barbara for chairing the event. And I'm going to hand over now to Iain Docherty, Dean for the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Stirling, who is also a member of the stewarding group for Scotland's Climate Assembly.
Iain, I was going to introduce you, but Susie
Sorry.
did it so well.
Sorry.
No, absolutely. This is teamwork. So,
stole your thunder.
Yeah. So I won't say any more because you've introduced him well, Iain. Off you go on the issues of transport and planning. No, we can't hear you. We've lost Iain. Just give him a second to pop back in, hopefully with a microphone this time. Here we go. Iain, are you there?
Hello.
Oh, fantastic. We can hear you. Off you go.
Thanks very much. Sorry, Susie, when you stopped presenting there, I suddenly started to hear two of you and the video crashed and the platform didn't like it, so it asked me to log back out and back in again, so hopefully you can see and hear me okay now. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Iain Docherty from the University of Stirling. I'm a transport researcher. I've been for 25 years looking at the transport sector and how we all move around impacts on our social lives, on the economy, and with increasing focus in recent years, of course, on the environment. And so I was very privileged to be asked by Susie and others to play a very small part in the Assembly on the Governance Board, and was lucky enough to speak to its members on a couple of occasions to discuss where transport and mobility fits into the decarbonisation imperative. So what I've been asked to do today is kind of give an overview about the field of transport mobility and how we're going to decarbonise it. And then hopefully that will stimulate some questions about where the transport system fits into some of the key issues about planning that you'll hear from the other speakers. So 3 things I'd like to do. Very briefly, talk about the state of play that we're in transport and climate emissions, and explain why where we are is really quite challenging, perhaps more so than many other sectors that we need to decarbonise. Then I'll speak a bit about what a realistic pathway to achieving net zero might be, and I hope as I go through reflect on some of the recommendations that came from the Assembly, and speak about the scale really of the critical challenges and the urgency of doing things differently in a very short period of time really. So in terms of the state of play, and it's important to say that these figures are pre-pandemic, and that's something I'll come back to. Transport accounted for just under 40% of the emissions inventory in Scotland, and importantly and worryingly, that figure really hadn't changed since 1990. We haven't made much of any progress in decarbonising the transport system over 30 years, and of course 1990, as we all know, is the baseline year against which our decarbonisation targets are set. Perhaps even more worryingly than that, if you look at the period in the run-up to the pandemic, things have actually been getting worse. So you can see from that graph that there was a reasonably steep fall in emissions from the transport sector, more or less coinciding with the global financial crash and the economic aftermath of that. But around 2013, transport emissions in Scotland began to bounce back. And until 2017, they rose. And in the most recent year's figures we've got, which is for 17-18, now they remained more or less static. They fell very slightly, but they were essentially just back at 1990s levels. So despite the climate crisis and the decarbonisation imperative being well known for a long time now, and despite the public debate speaking about it more and more in recent years, our performance in the transport sector was getting worse. And why I'd like to focus on that is because it's a really important insight into how our behaviours drive outcomes in the sector. This graph shows the components of the transport emissions inventory. First thing you can see right away is that car travel is responsible for 40% of transport emissions. So of all climate emissions in Scotland, car travel, private car travel, is responsible for 40% of 40%. By the time you add in other road traffic, so light vans and heavy goods vehicles, road traffic as a whole accounts for something like 2/3 of the emissions from the transport sector. And this graph shows which sectors were improving and which ones were deteriorating over that time. So perhaps surprisingly, if we start at the right-hand end, emissions from the rail sector were deteriorating. They were increasing, and that's largely because the rail sector was growing, but we hadn't really begun a programme of electrification of the kind that the Assembly members spoke about. Perhaps less surprising to see emissions from air travel rising strongly. Shipping, on the other hand, did quite well. Bus travel also, you may be aware of the increasingly strong European regulation for engines, which drove emissions reduction in the bus sector quite strongly. But perhaps the most important of those bars of all is the light vans number. So the emissions from light vans in the economy doubled in the period roughly for 30 years after 1990. And you can all imagine why that is. It's because of the extent to which we've become accustomed to on-demand deliveries. And interestingly, during the pandemic, while many of us have been working at home more, that figure has jumped again. So it's now probably about 115 to 120% of the 1990 figure, according to the very latest data that we've got. So in short, the problem is that transport and travel is about 40% of our carbon emissions. Of that 40% is cars. Before the pandemic, things hadn't improved in 30 years. And our behaviours recently were driving a further deterioration in the position, not just because we're buying more online, so we have more light vans running around. We've actually begun to buy bigger cars than before. So in the private car sector, all of those efficiencies in terms of engine technology that improved regulation has brought in over the last couple of decades are entirely cancelled out, and then probably even more so by our consumer choices to buy bigger and heavier vehicles. And of course, we all know about the growth in particularly low-cost aviation. So any realistic pathway to achieve net zero for transport is going to be very challenging indeed. And even more tricky, I think, is the public debate. And this is, for me, one of the strongest and most positive things to have come out of the Assembly in terms of its transport recommendations, is that they shine a light on just how superficial a lot of the debate about how we might decarbonise transport to date has been. If you were to go and ask members of the public about how they think transport's decarbonised, they'll nearly all, as a first response, talk about electric vehicles. The problem, of course, is that we know this is not enough. It's probably not enough per se, because vehicles obviously have embedded carbon in them from the materials and from the construction manufacturing process. So our best estimates are that if we were to achieve net zero through electrification of the fleet, or a combination of electrification and hydrogen vehicles, we'd probably only be able to afford about 75 or 80% of the vehicle fleet size we've currently got because of embedded carbon. But given the average car has a lifespan of about 15 years, it's too late. Even if we banned the sale of petrol and diesel cars on Monday morning, we would not be able to replace the fleet quickly enough to get us to net zero. So this, to me, is the fundamental understanding, which I think the work of the Climate Assembly and others is beginning to help take hold. And sometimes this medicine might not taste good, but it's really, really crucial. And the International Energy Agency, no less, has recently said that technology is not enough. And if you listen to the debate about COP, which was also about electric vehicles, coal and cars, as the Prime Minister said, that's just simply not enough. And we need to think about the behavioural change that we will all need to have if we're going to meet our emissions reductions trajectory. And as you'll have seen in the recommendations from the Assembly, essentially that's about doing something about this split of all journeys and how they're made in Scotland at the moment. So 2/3 of the trips we make are in a car, either as a driver or a passenger. And the public transport use we've got is very small, but 8% for bus. And despite the huge amounts of money we spend on it, only about 2.6% of our trips were by train pre-pandemic. Of course, now that's about half of that rate. Cycling, equally in Scotland, is very small, about 1.4% of trips. So even if we were to increase the rate of cycling really quite quickly, there's a long way to go to do something about the relative split of our mode choice across the economy. Then, of course, we've got some really quite difficult economic and political challenges from sectors that really are struggling to engage with this agenda really very much at all, I would argue. So aviation is perhaps the obvious one, and when you think about why people decide to fly rather than take the train for business trips, you can see that the behaviours that we've built up over decades, you know, this idea that it's a good thing to be a frequent flyer and that you should be rewarded for it. Sometimes we're going to have to completely change, flip by 180 degrees, our public understanding of what the right solutions and the right behaviours to help achieve decarbonisation in transport are. So to finish, in terms of critical challenges, one of the best things in the small group debates that I heard in the sessions of the Assembly that I was involved in is this conversation, which I think has become genuinely strong in Scotland, about what is a just transition to net zero and what is fair. Now, of course, those voices that to date have shouted loudest about fairness tend to be the ones for whom the currently very unfair system is the one they prefer to keep. So you'll probably be aware of the Fair Fuel UK campaign, which has sought a freeze or even a reduction in the taxes applied to petrol and diesel, and by some estimates has been successful in reducing the amount of tax generated by those fuels to the UK Exchequer by about £150 billion as the fuel tax escalator was abolished by Gordon Brown. The current system is massively unfair. Equally, and despite our best efforts, and this is where I hope to hear some really good positive news about change from our planning colleagues, despite our rhetoric about planning to reduce the need for us to travel around, particularly by car, we've not been very good at that in Scotland. And if you look at where the new housing developments we've seen over the past few decades have been, they've been overwhelmingly in low density peri-urban locations, where it's really hard actually for people to try and do the right thing, where walking and cycling is not especially easy in terms of access to work or other key services. And so that's something that the planning system has to address and address quickly. And then finally, I'd like to say a few things about us as consumers. So you'll be aware in the emissions debate more generally, and the Assembly has looked at issues like diet, for example, where our individual consumer choices are clearly at the front of the agenda, but so is the case in transport. So if you think about that light van number and the doubling of emissions, this is because we all hit that buy now button on our preferred internet platform. And whilst they might like to give us an image of your goods being delivered by a sustainable mode, in that case a bicycle, the reality is very, very different. And if I were to buy half a dozen items from Amazon, I increasingly expect to have them delivered tomorrow at the latest. Indeed, same-day delivery is becoming more and more prevalent in the market, and it could be 4 or 5 different vans that would undertake those journeys for me. So our consumer behaviour is what's really underpinning some of those deteriorations in the position. And it won't just be down to government, let alone technology, to fix that. It will be down to us and the choices we all make as individuals and citizens. But just to wrap up, the positive side of all of this is that we know how to fix transport. So there are some sectors of the economy, and possibly domestic heating is the best example of this, where we're really unsure about what the trajectory to reach net zero is. We're not sure about how effective the technologies for decarbonisation will be, and we're not sure about how quickly we can replace the technology in everybody's homes that we need to do in time for 2045. In transport, we do know. It's already done in several places. This is one of my favourite pictures. This happens to be Strasbourg in the east of France. But you can see this is a prosperous city centre where the private car and the light van doesn't need to be there. This is a picture of the kind of change which we know how to achieve: walking more, cycling more, and using higher quality public transport more. And if we're able to deliver that at pace and at scale in Scotland, we too can hopefully get there. So thank you very much for listening for the last 10 minutes. Really looking forward to the next presentations and the question and answer session. And of all the things that I've taken from the Assembly and its deliberations on transport, the idea that we might just all be better off and healthier by slowing down a little, and particularly going for a walk more often, has really resonated with me. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Iain, and thanks for making every single person in the virtual room feel guilty. So you all know what you need to stop doing. That's great. So we're going to hear a little bit now about some of the solutions from planning, I hope, from Robbie Calvert. He's going to talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods. Robbie is the Policy, Practice and Research Officer at RTPI Scotland. He's published a number of research reports for the RTPI, which you can read online. I would thoroughly recommend them. And he previously worked for Cairngorms National Park Authority in their planning team, so he does know what he's talking about. Robbie.
Thanks, Barbara. I hope everyone can hear me. And there's my slides. Thanks for having me today. And I'm going to respond to the Climate Assembly's recommendations for actions report regarding 20-minute neighbourhoods in particular. So I will quickly do what are 20-minute neighbourhoods and why. So I'll jump off with the Scottish Government's definition, which I think is quite neat. 20-minute neighbourhoods are a method of achieving connected and compact neighbourhoods designed in such a way that all people can meet the majority of their daily needs within a reasonable walk, wheel or cycle. So that's approximately 800 metres of their home. And in many ways, I see this as a fuller and clearer description in planning terms of what we actually mean when we say sustainable development. And the fundamental tenets of 20-minute neighbourhoods is not a necessarily new concept in planning, and this is why I've included the photos here of tenemental housing here in Edinburgh. But I think the value of this concept lies in the kind of renewed political and societal focus on neighbourhoods resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this has provided an opportunity for the planning profession to sort of reposition itself as the sort of proactive and visionary discipline, which will be critical in supporting post-COVID recovery, but also achieving net zero targets. So quickly, what are the aims of a 20-minute neighbourhood? Well, by reducing the need to travel and by reducing the desirability of travelling by private vehicle, the goal is to achieve this kind of modal shift away from private vehicles, which Iain has been discussing. And with this, improve health outcomes, so through encouraging active travel, but also by reducing air pollution. Also regenerating urban centres, including town centres. So moving forward, can town centres be exemplar 20-minute neighbourhoods, enhancing social cohesion and of course supporting carbon net zero targets. On the bottom right here, I have Waltham Forest. So this is called the Mini Holland project, which I think is which was done a number of years ago now, which is many 20 neighbourhood-esque interventions. And now we have research published about the outcomes of such interventions, and it has indeed showed improved health outcomes, a dissipation of traffic. So we've seen this modal shift away from private vehicles, enhanced social cohesion, but actually other things like a reduction in street crime, which is very interesting. So I just want you to keep in mind these kind of tangible outcomes of such interventions, and we're going to revisit these outcomes and focus on outcomes later on. But if we're agreeing that this is a useful context and concept, where do we go next? And as a quick shameless plug, this year I published a piece of research looking at how to implement 20-minute neighbourhoods in planning policy and practice. So moving along. Whilst a global concept and very popular across the world, very much embedded in central policy here in Scotland. So in the recently published programme for government, that set out the aim to revitalise local communities through the development of 20-minute neighbourhoods. And this includes investment in town centres and a new focus on place. So improving local services and infrastructure and aiding this governmental ambition to live well locally. And this is all whilst achieving a 20% reduction in car kilometres driven by 2030. The Scottish Government have also committed to rolling out 20 miles per hour speed limits on appropriate roads in built up areas. So traffic calming being another important intervention to achieve 20-minute neighbourhoods. Of course, we've had the draft National Planning Framework 4 recently published, and this concept is very well embedded in here, especially Section 7, which is called Living Locally. I'll come back to this later on in more detail. Just moving on to the recommendations for action report. Firstly, just to say congratulations to everyone who's been involved with this. I think it's a really interesting read, and I encourage everyone to read it. I think it provides some excellent ideas, and I think it also just goes to show what can be achieved when we are bold and imaginative with what we can do with community engagement, and of course give it the correct investment that it needs. So in this report, there is a section on how to realise the principles of what's called the 20-minute community within the report. And there's a number of recommendations in there. So, for example, improved broadband connectivity to support home working, investing in improving public space to make them safer and more appealing to walk and cycle in, the reuse of vacant buildings in town centres. It also calls for reform of the planning laws, but in particular, this is relating to developer obligations to better include consideration of community infrastructure needs. It does discuss the rural context, so supporting rural localized living through sort of guaranteeing access to services through remote or digital or mobile provision. There's also support for work hubs and shared work facilities. So that's for people who are self-employed or even people who are employed. And there's also an interesting reflection from the Children's Parliament on the importance of sustainable transport to schools. There is also other recommendations sitting elsewhere throughout the report that I think can help support the implementation of 20-minute neighbourhoods. So I've just pulled two out here, one on reforming community land ownership, so in empowering local communities to manage underused or unproductive and unoccupied land in and around them to address the climate emergency. And this has been proposed in the report through land ownership reform. But also funding streams for community climate action projects. So how as planners can we respond to this report? Is there work we are already doing? Is there new policy coming down the pipeline? Or is there things we need to look at afresh and really challenge the way we do things? So as I was saying earlier, I think a good place to start is with the draft NPF 4. Like I will stress at this stage, it is a draft. But there's some really interesting stuff in there relating to 20-minute neighbourhoods, which responds to a lot of the asks within the report. So within Policy 7, local living, this is split into two parts. So one relating to local development plans, which should support the principle of 20-minute neighbourhoods. And that's looking at how we do things like transport appraisals, but also reimagining development on the urban fringe. It also sets out the need to provide flexible and tailored approach to rural locations. And quite interesting, a role for the place principle, which I'll come back to later on. It also discusses the need to minimize future commuting and ensure that jobs and income can stay within areas and support the community wealth building agenda. And I think this is interesting to note that this actually isn't in the Climate Assembly report. And I think maybe there's a lesson there about new terminology and concepts and then maybe taking a while to really permeate into the general public. There's also a connection made between the rollout of 20-minute neighbourhoods and the potential benefits for biodiversity through increasing connectivity. The second part of this policy looks at development management. So development proposals that are consistent with the principles of the 20-minute neighbourhood should be supported, considering things like public and active travel, but also services. So think shopping, healthcare, social services, educational, play space, green space, as well as the levels of interconnectivity that the proposed development has with the surrounding neighbourhoods. It also discusses affordable housing options, the ability to age in place, and things like housing diversity too. Now, there is other parts of the draft MPF4 that are relevant to 20-minute neighbourhoods. I'm just going to highlight a few here. We have Policy 10 on sustainable transport. So planning applications for significant travel generating uses should not be supported at locations which would increase reliance on the private car. So this kind of presumption against this kind of development really provides that policy support, which would reinforce the concept around 20-minute neighbourhoods. There's also relevant bits in policy 24 and 25 around town centres and retail. So the town centre first assessment used to kind of support a centre, a network of centres as it's described, and kind of encouraging neighbourhood shopping in line with the 20-minute neighbourhood principle. I think it's also worth noting that the draft MPF4 has a strong emphasis on the reuse of vacant and derelict land as well. I think it's also worth noting some of the national developments that are being promoted and how they can potentially contribute to the aspirations of the 20-minute neighbourhood. We have National Development 2, which is on the National Walking, Cycling and Wheeling Network. We have Urban Mass Transit Networks, National Development 3. And this is intended to support the rollout of 20-minute neighbourhoods and improve transport equity. We have the digital fibre network, so that's National Development 6, and which very much support this kind of new emphasis on living locally and reducing emissions from travelling. So that very much addresses one of the asks out of the Climate Assembly report. There's also other national developments, such as the Central Scotland Green Network, which will play an important role in servicing neighbourhoods with high quality green space. So I'd like to draw on some of the statements of ambitions that Barbara discussed earlier on and in this report. And firstly, the one setting out that we need to act urgently and decisively to establish an agreed plan and a measurable timescale for delivery. And I think this is particularly pertinent given the publication of the draft MPF4. And we are yet to see a draft MPF4 delivery plan published. And I know, and at RTPI, we believe the success of the MPF4 will very much be in its implementation, not its preparation. So to enable this vision to be delivered on the ground with these kind of clear, trackable milestones and outcomes, we feel it needs to be accompanied with a 10-year capital investment plan. And importantly as well, to ensure that planners themselves have the adequate resources to deliver this change on the ground. Now, there is other parts of the planning system other than the MPF4 that can influence and impact upon 20-minute neighbourhoods. So parts of the Planning Act that are yet to be implemented. So thinking about the development plan regulations, open space strategies, for example. But there's also lots of opportunity in other national policy statements, such as designing streets and creating places, and maybe opportunity to revamp the development planning, transport appraisal guidance as well. So all of this could be potentially adjusted to better support this concept going forward. In terms of compulsory purchase order reform, and this is very much addressing the point brought up by the Climate Assembly regarding vacant space in city centres and town centres. The Scottish Government are in the coming year and in advance of the bill later on in the Parliament commencing stakeholder engagement towards a future reform and modernisation of the compulsory purchase order system in Scotland. And the aim of this is to really create a system which is much clearer, fairer and faster for all parties. In regard to the point made about community infrastructure, we do now have a statement of community benefit. So this is a duty imposed on developers within the draft National Planning Framework 4. But this is amongst a package of other things that Scottish Government are currently doing. So they've recently commissioned and published some research on the use of Section 75 planning obligations. And the findings of this, together with the new power for an infrastructure levy introduced in the Planning Act, will inform the sort of next steps where to go with planning obligations. And this is with a view of introducing new legislation around 2023, 2024. Also within the statement of ambition is the kind of desired intention to empower local communities to be able to collaborate and drive change. And this is around infrastructure, service provision, land use, and the economy. And this is in ways that will work in their place and really facilitate this localized living. And we very much think that the successful operationalization of 20-minute neighborhoods is going to require this collaborative work. And that'll be across a wide range of stakeholders in the public and private sector and the third sector, but of course, with communities themselves. And we really believe there's a clear opportunity to deliver 20-minute neighborhoods using sort of new place-based ways of working, and that the planning system can be a facilitator of these place-based approaches with use of, for example, the place principle. And I think it's really good to see that this has been recognised in the draft NPF4, and a link has been made between the establishment of 20-minute neighbourhoods and the use of the place principle to do so. However, if the place principle is to be effective, we really need to give it teeth, and we need to ensure that it's transparent in how it is considered in the decision-making process. And importantly, that it's enforced too, so we can really see it influencing the policy practice and, importantly, the investment on the ground. And of course, we need to think about this kind of community-led planning, and local place plans are a really important vehicle to do so, and they have been mentioned in the report as well. So the regulations are due to come into force at the start of next year, and alongside work to prepare new guidance on effective community engagement as well. There still is a big question about how these are to be funded. Finally, the statement of ambition goes on to say that Scotland should develop a holistic approach to evaluating success and change, and measuring things like sustainability and happiness, not just profit, when we're considering Scotland's wealth. And I think certainly from a planning perspective, if we're to seek better quality placemaking outcomes, then we're going to have to change how we measure performance. And this is why I've got this picture up here, but this is the Measuring What Matters Planning Outcomes research that we published last year. And this provides a toolkit and a route map to moving towards an outcomes-based approach to performance management. And in the context of a 20-minute neighbourhood, and as an existing means of assessing the outcome of the planning process in terms of design and place quality, we have design quality audits. And just noting that these have not been mentioned in the draft NPF4. But you could imagine these could be amended to include the placemaking considerations associated with 20-minute neighbourhoods, and applicants could be encouraged to use the quality audit as a basis for their design statements. So I've probably whittled on too long there. Please add me on Twitter and give me an email if you want to follow up on anything here, and looking forward to the questions.
Thanks very much, Robbie. We'll move on to our final speaker now, who's going to lead on from that discussion to talk about standards and regulations, which I think it's the giving things teeth. Stuart's the Director of Place at Loch, Lomond and Trossachs National Park, but he's here today in his, if you like, Team Scotland role, as he's a member of the Heads of Planning Scotland Executive Committee. So he's not only speaking for himself, but for all of the heads of planning right across Scotland. Go, Stuart.
Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here, and hopefully you can hear and see me okay. So yeah, speaking for Heads of Planning Scotland, which is a representative organisation for local planning authorities, strategic authorities and national park authorities in Scotland. And my brief is to talk about standards and regulation, and I'll I suppose pick up a bit, I suppose, what Robbie's already kind of covered to an extent, and expand and look in a few areas in particular. But first off, so I'm just going to give a bit of an overview in terms of reflections, comments, observations on the Assembly's report, and then just talk a bit about the kind of the challenges, the role for planning, and the opportunities in this kind of space. So first off, I have to say I was hugely impressed with the report. It's comprehensive. It really homes in with precision on particular points. So that makes it, helpful and really much easier to understand and see the application. Obviously delighted to see the recognition of the role that planning can play, and across a number of areas, so delighted to see that as well. And while we may focus on standards and regulation, planning is a much broader enabler. It's a regulatory activity in terms of the control of the use of land and regulating new development, but actually it links with other activities, other government functions. It can inform other areas, support and help deliver as well. From some of the issues that planning tackles, it can then lead to a consequence that can incentivise and can help deliver other outcomes, such as kind of health and well-being, active travel, healthy living, if you like, as well. And one of the main things that in the standards regulations section of the report is the recommendation in Greenfield and Brownfield development, and certainly a fair point to include. Absolutely, I think this is really kind of quite a bread and butter conversation for planners. Planning came about from really trying to tackle kind of ribbon development and as one of its drives. So where development goes in the best location is at our core. And in terms of this, obviously one of the roles for planning is to identify land that's needed for different uses and the best place for it. And obviously in some locations there is brownfield land, it can be regenerated, and there's a long history of this. If you look at our major cities, Glasgow, Dundee, Edinburgh, there's waterfront areas that have been redeveloped. But there's other parts of the country that that don't have brownfield land, and so I guess the kind of question is, well, if we with the demand and the need to identify land for development and housing land, then that's about steering development to where more brownfield is, but some locations just don't have it. There's obviously land ownership can be a challenge, the condition of land can be a challenge, and so the points here about the tests that need to be applied, that is something which there's more content on this in the draft NPF4. I think it's already had inclusion, and many plans and strategies do focus on our towns and city centres where there is brownfield land. So I think one of the things that perhaps will need considered in this, and maybe we'll see some comments, there's other kind of fiscal incentives that may be needed to incentivise support the priority on brownfield as well. For many years there's been, obviously we've got an established vacant and derelict land register. There's funding that goes with that, so there has been work, but there's still obviously sites which just are not moving, and so I agree there should be a focus here. And looking across the report, there's obviously many of the other kind of recommendations and goals which touch planning, what it can do, what it can support, in terms of doing our work. So there was reference earlier about in terms of building quality and passive house standards. Certainly for me, I'm seeing more applications for passive house development which would be accredited in terms of passive house, but given that at the moment with it would exceed the building standards regulation, so it's something which is not required. So it's a fair point that is there. There's obviously much that can be achieved through good design. So from the siting, from orientation, from achieving solar gain, screening as well. So there's much that can be done, but passive house standards are something which we are seeing more of. But it's not currently, because it goes beyond the current requirements, certainly in building regulations. But site-specific considerations there are really important, really key. And of the other recommendations there that touch planning, certainly with the point that was made about communities, absolutely planners are well placed to through engagement and plan preparation, and to they've got the skills to bring together communities, other landowners, and there's been many examples through the kind of charrettes that took place across the country that can really bear fruit in terms of get a collaborative approach, but with a with a climate kind of friendly kind of thinking. So there's already much else there, and there's other practical things as well, such as in terms of there's inclusion and reference to EV charging, and so obviously with new development, we do need to make sure that the infrastructure is there, conducting, and so that it can accommodate now and also in the future. One of the challenges is as many will know, is just the electricity network as well, to facilitate that. So just there's much that planning does do, but there's obviously much more we can do. And the point was made about consistency and mandatory standards and requirements. And obviously we need the national policies to be in place. That's important for consistency, for clarity in terms of expectation of both applicants and communities as well. But there's a whole number of topics there that I've just put in the screen where planning does do and can help to do more that can help respond to climate change. And just kind of turning to kind of more opportunities, if you like. So within many plans there is reference about biodiversity, the need for enhancement and improvement, but clearly there's more that can be done, and planning for nature and development is something that we need to consider more. And while there's been some work that's been done to protect green spaces, but actually planning can help to influence the use of land and can identify the aspirations. And the slide here is an example from my own authority in the centre of the National Park at Trossachs, where with the community we've mapped out what the development needs, but equally where's the potential for investment in nature and improvement in nature. So peatland restoration and tree planting, sustainable practices in terms of kind of flood management. So there's opportunities there, and for us to take and think beyond what the rule book says at times as well, and seek to deliver these kind of wider outcomes. With reference to national planning framework, as Robbie has, and I think it's really encouraging in a number of fronts. Just from an initial read, I think it responds to a number of areas within the Climate Assembly report, and that's a great direction of travel. In terms of being the new status that the NPF4 will have. So, and just on challenges, obviously planners are very well placed in terms of the skill set that we have, but responding to the kind of technical points within the report, the recommendations, on assessments, we need to, planners will need to be able to access specialist advice, but there will also be the need to kind of upskill as well, and not just for planning staff and planners, but equally for our councillors and members, so that they've got that skills, they've got the experience there and understanding as well. So there's that kind of development of skills, and I think planners are well placed, but we will need access to the skills there. Funding and resourcing is obviously key as well. HOPS is supporting the RTPI's work in terms of highlighting the need for planning to be resourced and to have access to, obviously in terms of the right number of planners within planning teams, but equally the resources they need to do their work, which is something key to highlight as well in terms of responding to the recommendations. And so I'll close there. I hope that's been a helpful kind of overview and run through, and look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks very much, Stuart. So if all of our speakers could put their cameras back on, so I can see who I'm picking on when I ask you a question from our audience. And I have a question here, which I hope you don't mind, but Manassa was in there right at the start with the first question on our chat function, and I'm going to adapt the question ever so slightly, because he's pointing out, and this would otherwise one be just for you, Iain, adopting Greenfield takes time. So how will this work in the fact that we need immediate action? Actually, a lot of what we've talked about today from all of you will take time to make happen. So how do we act now? What do we need to do to act now? Or what does government need to do to allow you to act now to make the changes necessary? Iain, since the question was based around transport, I'll come to you first, but what's the single thing that will allow action now? If you can stay with us, you're popping on and off, but I hope we can hear you.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm not entirely sure I've been able to unmute successfully again.
I can hear you. Yeah, you're fine.
All right. Okay, great. I can hear about 3 of you, but I'll try and keep going. I think the single biggest thing that government can do is to start being honest about the need for behaviour change. So, politicians of all stripes, for obvious reasons, prefer carrots to sticks. It's much, much easier for them to stand and cut a ribbon on a new public transport scheme and talk about how many car trips this is going to take off the road than it is to put the price of parking up or to introduce a road pricing scheme. So honesty in the debate, frankly, is the most important thing for me. I don't underestimate how difficult that is. And one of the things that concerns me about the likelihood of it happening soon is that if you look at even the very modest pop-up active travel schemes that were put in place to try and encourage people to walk and cycle more during the pandemic, they're already being ripped out in many places, and because of the really, frankly, crass local political and community organisation that happens whenever we try to rebalance or make things fairer in terms of transport. So I think it's really difficult, but it's time for leadership. No more war on the motorist kind of stuff, because we're either in a climate emergency or we're not. And if we are, we have to start acting to do something about it, and that means honesty in the debate.
Good point. I agree wholeheartedly with you. Susie, from the Assembly's point of view, is there anything that came out of that you think an immediate action that would help to achieve any of the outcomes? It doesn't have to be transport related.
I think the thing that I was really struck by was, and I said this in the chat, but probably worth saying this again, was by how when members were given the knowledge about the impact of what we're doing now, but also the benefits of change, the members really grasped it and were much more ambitious than perhaps planners and politicians and others would imagine that they would be. And so I guess the thing that I would also say is that the members were really keen that although they came together as ordinary members of the public, that we didn't always focus on individual actions, although clearly, and as Iain says, we absolutely do all have to change our individual behaviour, but that it shouldn't always be pushed back down to what can we do as individuals, but what can society do? How can government and planners and local authorities help people to make the decisions that they need to make in terms of their individual behaviour? And so it isn't just saying to people, you need to change, you need to have more active travel, you need to think about using public transport more. It's saying, how can we make it so it's more attractive to walk because it's just too difficult to do it by a private car? How can we make public transport cheaper and easier and more convenient than the alternative? And so I think it's a bit of carrot and stick, that we make it difficult to do some of the things which we know we shouldn't be doing, but we really make it easy to do the things which we ought to be doing, because there are much wider benefits coming from that as well. So I guess a bit of carrot and stick could be the kind of short answer to that.
That fits well with Iain's comment about honesty as well. Robbie, what single thing, given, and I know MPF4 is in draft, but let's not sit around and wait for it. 20-minute neighbourhoods is something we've been talking about for a while. We know it's not going to come out of it. So what single thing would help that start to happen now? Oops, I can't hear you. Maybe while we figure out what's going on with Robbie's microphone, Stuart, clearly bringing in new regulations and all the rest of it also takes time. So what would make it easier for a planner's job to make some of these things happen?
Yeah, I think skills and confidence, is something that, for the profession, for heads of planning to support, planning staff, because actually there's a lot of tools in the toolbox already. I think we've got to really kind of, really look at those. And I think for me, I know planners are passionate about the environment, their natural environment, their built environment. So it's almost like we challenge ourselves to say, what's going to be your legacy? So take each case, think very carefully, and look at the potential. So, I think that would be my kind of, the kind of headline, Barbara. But I could probably say more.
Okay, we may have Robbie coming back into the room. I see. Oh no, he's dropped off again. I'll just move on rather than faffing about. We have a question from Stuart Hay. Sorry, Robbie, I've moved on.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, but you can maybe answer this as part of this question. I'll come to you first. Has the planning system fostered or hindered the growth in transport emissions in Scotland in terms of land use decisions and local urban design? What changes in practice and culture are needed? And I suppose, given that your topic was on 20-minute neighbourhoods, Robbie, what changes in practice and culture are needed to make those happen, rather than the issues that we see in perhaps some of the suburban estates that we created in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see a lot of that. I think there's a strong policy steer away from that kind of development, and even the wording when it's saying it's going to transform how we develop at the peripheries of urban centres, I think is quite important that they included that kind of wording, but also the presumption against development, which will generate a lot of car traffic as well. So I think it's really important to I think those two bits there in the 20-minute neighbourhood section will be critical there. Back to the one thing I think we need from government, well, it's funding, and especially with the budget on the 9th of December. And we recently published a piece of work where we figured out exactly how much funding we need for the statutory planning system, and that's to the tune of 4.8 million in this budget, and that will start the climate action now.
So Stuart, you said there was already a lot in the toolkit around making things happen. Are there changes in practice and culture that are needed, or is it simply confidence?
I think it's the capacity and the resources is really key, because that because obviously we want quality decisions, we want quality development. It shouldn't just be about the kind of determination time hitting its target. So I think if you've got the capacity, then you're investing in in planners. You're giving them the space. You're giving them the access to the expertise. So that is it's beyond skills and competence. That's one of them. It's the resources. It's the capacity.
And Iain, obviously your expertise is in the transport field, and sometimes we think of planning and transport planning as being quite separate activities. Are there culture changes that are needed?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I'm wondering whether to choose my words carefully here, given the planning audience that we've got today. So it's back to the honesty thing. Does anybody genuinely believe that we've done land use planning well in Scotland for the last 40 years? Because whenever I walk out my front door, I see really poor quality development that isn't really well served by public transport and does nothing to advance the agenda. And we've been talking about integrating land use and transport planning since at least the major interwar plans, haven't we? So that's 90 years now we haven't done it. We've been talking about the need to reduce car dependence since at least the early 1990s, seriously, and the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. So that's 30 years. I still see more supermarkets and more very low density housing in the wrong places, and key public services that are built in the wrong places, like all of our nice new major hospitals that are on the fringes of the cities instead of in the city centres. So, I'm tempted to say that I think some honesty is required within the professions as well about actually how far behind our rhetoric our actual policies might be.
And is that, Susie, the sense that you got from Climate Assembly members? Because you said that actually, given the information, they were much braver and bolder than professions and politicians are.
Yeah, and I think Talking about a culture change, it's something which they actually called for in their statement of ambition. They wanted a culture change in Scotland underpinned by education so that people understood both why they had to make the changes, but the benefits of making the changes. But my feeling is, and I don't know whether this is a COP-related spike or not, that actually there has been a cultural change in Scotland, that people do want to make a difference in terms of climate change and to live differently. And I think, as certainly when the members were discussing towards the end of their deliberations in March, when we were just at that point thinking we might be coming out of the pandemic, they really felt that that was a pivot point in terms of how we did things in Scotland, and that there was an opportunity to do things differently, having experienced things being done very differently during the pandemic, and understanding much more about climate change and the emergency that it was, that this was an opportunity to reformat how we did things way forward, and that was really much more part of the culture. And I saw a survey which has been conducted last week, which suggested that climate change was one of the most pressing topics for people across the UK when they were asked what concerns you most. And so I feel as though we're going with the flow with this. The members have demonstrated that the wider public actually want us to do things differently, and really it's everything else catching up with it, that there has been this culture change perhaps, but perhaps it hasn't quite come through in terms of what we actually do on the ground.
Thanks for that. It's interesting. John Walls has made a comment and speaks to one of my passions about reuse, reduce, recycle. Actually, 90% of what we're going to have, we've already got in terms of built infrastructure for Scotland for years and years to come. So our biggest issues are around retrofitting existing buildings, existing communities, existing travel patterns, and doing that in a just way. Because I think that's one of the things that obviously the government has talked about is a just transition. So any thoughts on this enormous topic on how we start to make that happen without buckets of cash, which clearly is going to be an issue for a lot of people, but there've got to be some quick wins that we can have on that. Iain, any thoughts on retrofitting our town infrastructure?
Yeah, quite a few about that. I think there's a slightly different point I'd like to make first, though, about how we get, I suppose, popular consent to do these things. So to take the positivity that Susie talked about that was in the recommendations in the beginning of change and turn it into proactive policy. And this is fundamentally a debate about inequality, because if you look at how we travel around, there's a small number of people that travel around a hell of a lot, and usually by the most polluting modes. So for example, when you go on a plane, you're surrounded by people who are often on a plane because the use of that mode is so peaky. The same is actually true for the rail network as it's currently configured. A very small proportion of people actually use the train in Scotland. And I should have known this, but I didn't until this statistic was given to me by a colleague in the rail industry recently, that even in the catchment of the Glasgow rail network, often talked about as the biggest one in the UK outside London, less than half the adults in Greater Glasgow had used the train once in the previous month, pre-pandemic. So we've got this really, really important, expensive and potentially useful asset that we don't use, frankly. And it's empty most of the time. So there's a big issue about equality. There's a big issue about understanding who travels, how and why. And there's a reconfiguration of networks that has to go on in there. So MPF4 begins to talk about that and talks about mass rapid transit in the cities. Really hoping that the Strategic Transport Projects Review, which is due out in the middle of January, will go for that strongly. And the simplest way for us to retrofit our existing network, most of which is roads, is to stop managing it to accommodate more and bigger vehicles. If we want to reduce traffic, and we've signed up, the government has a target to reduce road kilometres in Scotland by 20%, over a decade. That's not going to happen by chance. It's going to happen by making driving more difficult and more expensive. And actually, if we do the things we know work, like reallocate road space away from cars to pedestrians and cyclists, then guess what? We make it easier for people to be active. We make it more difficult for people to drive. And the outcome of that is we make things fairer, and we reduce emissions. It's the politics that's stopping it happening, not any of the technical understanding.
Thanks. Susie, was there discussion in the Assembly around that issue of retrofit and fairness?
Yeah, no, definitely. So fairness was such a huge theme, and often members would say, but we need to make sure that we make allowance for people who, for whatever reason, are not going to be covered by this particular recommendation. And so there was also quite a lot of thinking about what we do in rural areas, which I think is, often we talk about what happens in the Central Belt, and there, the excuses are much less for some of the ways that we're currently behaving. But in rural areas, there are still things which we can do to make it better. And so I think in terms of what members really wanted, they really wanted things to happen quickly. So they recognised that some of the things would take a bit longer, but some of the things are so simple. We saw it during the pandemic, and that's actually what members said. During the pandemic, people were discouraged from travelling as much and encouraged to do much more active travel. And lo and behold, there was more active travel and there was fewer journeys. And as soon as the restrictions were lifted, people went back to living exactly the way they had before. And I think sometimes it is a difficult conversation, which politicians and others are perhaps a bit hesitant to get involved with. But I think what I would say from our members is that they shouldn't be as hesitant, that there are opportunities and that members will really be supportive, and the wider public.
I'm going to come to you, Stuart, on thoughts for retrofitting some communities rather than buildings as a whole, for example, because we do have a legacy of planning in the past where perhaps the suburbanisation of certain places in particular, or satellite development has meant that achieving living locally where you can live, work, play, and do all the things that you need, access all the services you need, isn't possible. Is there some way that planning can start to think about retrofitting those communities to make living locally more of a possibility?
Well, I guess we have a plan-led approach. So therefore, by planning for what we're describing, then that gives us absolutely the best chance of getting to what's being described. I think the challenge is that, yeah, sure, we can point to good planning decisions, bad planning decisions, but the point is that planning's juggling population change, economy, environmental constraints, land ownership, the land availability, viability of development. So there's a whole bunch of things that planning's charged with. So it's a big job. And I think the other point is interesting in references behaviour change, because actually I agree there is something there, because planning is responding to demand, to user demand, to the type of houses people want to build. So I guess that is a kind of grown-up conversation about, well, okay, where do we want to go if there's things that haven't happened the way they should? But back to your point there, just a bit about the retrofit. I think the 20-minute neighbourhood concept is excellent, and that really gives us the chance to focus on, well, what assets does a town, does a village, does a city have? And in terms of action and what Susie's describing, now's a really great time for communities to be active. Local community place plans, they're going to be really powerful. There's a number, certainly in the national park, that communities are really grabbing onto this. That can influence the local development plans that are about to start to be prepared as the MPF is finalised. So just a few thoughts there, Barbara.
Yeah, and leading in nicely to 20-minute neighbourhoods, and Robbie, and actually Lee Hunter has talked about the opportunity for communities to feed indirectly to achieving some of the aims of 20-minute neighbourhoods. I think there needs to be something put in place that communities themselves can generate these ideas and make things happen without going through a whole bureaucracy.
Well, I'm sort of jumping on what Stuart just said. I see local place plans as the vehicle to do that, and 20-minute neighbourhoods is a way to start that conversation. How would you like to deliver your 20-minute neighbourhoods? and what kind of interventions would you like to prioritise? Because we have this immovable net zero target that we need to achieve, and it's going to be difficult, but it doesn't mean we can't take communities with us, and I think this report really highlights that and some of the great thinking there, and help them focus us as to what kind of interventions they would like to see first.
Okay, thanks for that. We've just got a few minutes before we want to conclude. So I was wondering if you'd like to tackle something that Sam Whitmore has brought in. Has COP26 actually undermined the urgency required to make the changes needed? We focused a lot on COP26. There was a lot of talk about COP26. So do you think that was a bit of a distraction, Iain?
No. I understand why that impression is real, though. So, I mean, again, I come back to the point about it's all too easy for politicians and particularly producer interests to talk about technology as a solution to problems, because that implies behaviour change isn't required. This is what I call that it's okay, my next BMW will be an electric one fallacy, which people are all too easy to buy into. So there was some of that. At the Transport Day at COP, for example, on the original agenda, there was no discussion of public transport and active travel. It was all about changing propulsion for road vehicles, which tells you something about the technological and producer capture of the debate. However, I actually think the engagement of young people in this, and that we saw really clearly through the process, is highly positive, because they do have a really different outlook on this. They don't expect to grow up into a world which is as car dominated as the one that we find ourselves in at the moment. They have a different view about what community is, how active it should be, what resources it should offer, and how its residents, its citizens should act in places and between one another. So I think that's really positive. I think it's long overdue as well, because part of the fairness issue, which is another one of those topics that we dare not really talk about, is the intergenerational unfairness of all of this. And that's absolutely gross in this country, as well as between different parts of the world, in terms of who's consumed the carbon and what the values in the current built environment, in terms of the housing stock, etc., are all about. We know all of these things. So, I think we're getting there. I think that debate's really positive. I think it might be quite spiky and quite difficult on the way through, I have to say. But maybe we need that to get the kind of action we need in time.
Yeah, and I won't pick on Stuart about how we engage young people in planning debate, because that's a conversation that we've been having for since the point when I was a young person. So that's actually a long time. I think, Iain, that's a really good note to end the meat of our discussion on. Susie, I'm going to ask you to conclude anyway, so you can have your say and conclude, and perhaps we get to see some of the fabulous illustrations that have been worked on while we've been talking.
Absolutely. I just wanted to draw attention on that final point to a comment which Shona has put into the chat. And Shona was actually one of our Assembly members, and so is absolutely to be listened to ahead of many others. And she said, in answer to that question about COP, there's been a change in thinking since COP, and I would say that there are many more people who were largely unaware of how much could be done, and now understand that there are things that we can do. Education and information to help citizens understand the need for change is crucial, and that's why Assembly members are so passionate. The question now is how we keep the momentum going, and not just have a wee flurry of activity post-COP and then return to pre-COVID habits again. So I just wanted to highlight that from Shona, which I think is an excellent place to finish. I'm going to start off with Jules, who I think you can see the illustration that they have done. I don't know whether we can highlight it so we can see it in it across the full screen.
I wonder maybe if the rest of us put our... Oh, no, here we go. Brilliant.
Looks like it's coming. Excellent. So thank you very much for Jules. So it shows things about a real and urgent issue, 20-minute neighbourhoods, live well locally, planners must be carbon literate, planners, what's going to be your legacy, capacity of resources is key, engagement of young people is positive, and there was more active travel during the pandemic. Build in the right places. So that is that's the contribution from Jules, which we will send around to everybody afterwards so that you can look at it in a bit more detail. I'm going to pass now to Jenny, who I think is going to share screen or hold up your screen, hold up a picture. Jenny, are you going to share your screen? Can we do that? Jenny, can you do that? It looks as though Jenny's maybe just having a technical issue. So I'm going to move on to Alice. And Alice, I know, is going to hold it physically up. So we'll try to do that just to see what Alice has drawn. Alice, can you hold up your screen? Hold up your picture?
I think she's maybe frozen. So we've maybe only managed to get one illustration.
Alice and Jenny, one last call to see whether we can get your illustrations. No, I don't think it's going to work, so don't worry about it. We will make sure that we can send it round to you afterwards. I think what you saw from Jules just indicates how talented Jules, Jenny and Alice all are, and how exciting their illustrations are, and it will just give you a chance to revisit what was discussed today. So just a final reminder from me to please encourage your organisations to sign the Civic Charter with the hashtag Sign for Scotland, and feel free to contact us if you want some more information about it. And then finally, just to thank again RTPI and particularly Barbara for fantastic chairing of the event today, and also the speakers. I found it incredibly engaging and stimulating, and I'm sure the members will also be thrilled to see how much care and attention has been taken in looking at their recommendations. So thank you everyone for your contributions today. We're really very grateful.
Thanks very much, Susie. Thanks to all our speakers. Thanks to our illustrators. I look forward to seeing the two that we didn't manage to see today. For everybody who's online at the moment, the video for this will be shared with everyone. So please do share it more broadly so that others can watch. As Susie said, the illustrations will be shared as well. So that's us run to time, which is quite an achievement. Thanks very much, everybody, for being so sharp. I hope you all have a good evening. We'll just end the webinar now. Thanks, everybody. Bye.